1924, a young girl found an extraordinary object deep in the jungles of Central America. It was a beautiful skull made from a single block of pure quartz crystal. Anna Mitchell-Hedges claimed that her skull had magical telepathic powers.
She felt that he could stare into the left eye socket and see the future.
Some say that Anna's crystal skull is part of an ancient legend. That one day 13 such skulls will come together as one to solve some of the great mysteries of life. But only if we are morally and spiritually ready to receive them. Some of these crystal skulls may have already been discovered. There is one in London, one in Paris, and one in Washington. What is the truth behind the legend of these crystal skulls? Modern science has begun to investigate, and now we can reveal the shocking reality behind the story of Anna and these crystal skulls. Will they really lead to a new dawn for the human race and save our planet from an apocalyptic end? The story of Anna and the crystal skulls begins with Anna's adopted father, Frederick Albert Mitchell-Hedges. A self-made man and adventurer who is said to be one of the inspirations for Hollywood's blockbuster movies, Indiana Jones. Born in Victorian London in 1882, Mitchell-Hedges started out as a clerk in London's stock exchange at the age of 16, but he didn't stay long. In his 20s, he sailed to New York and worked on Wall Street, where he made a small fortune.
I had left home with a few pounds and no job, and I returned at the age of 23 an assured man of the world, possessor of over £4,000.
He then decided to become an explorer and archaeologist. Supported by rich girlfriends and various newspapers, Mitchell-Hedges devoted his life to the exploration of Central America and the Caribbean coast.
He took in a number of well-off ladies who traveled with him and in one case essentially funded him. I suppose you'd call him a good time boy.
Mitchell-Hedges believed that a life which is lived without zest and adventure is not a life at all.
You can almost hear the biceps rippling under his shirt.
He loved to do battle with giant sea fish.
Every fish he caught was the largest fish that had ever been caught in that area.
I landed sharks of 800, 900 and 1,000 pounds. Then, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I struck into a fish that gave me my hardest fight ever. It was a giant sawfish, 29 feet long, with a girth of 19 feet and just over 2 tons.
He claimed to have discovered a new race of people in Panama.
I now set about the task of discovering Central America. Thousands of square miles were uninhabitable, and there were wide regions of jungle, swamp and mountains where no man had ever set foot.
He stated that he excavated 21 sites in Central America and told many tall tales.
Every bit of jungle was crawling with poisonous snakes and poisonous plants.
He even claimed to have unearthed artifacts as old as 25,000 years from the lost civilization of Atlantis.
Anyone who writes a book called Danger Is My Ally, you know what sort of person you're dealing with.
But despite his bravado, Mitchell-Hedges was keen to be taken seriously as an archaeologist.
Mitchell-Hedges certainly collected a lot of exotic archaeological material, some of which he illustrates in his books.
I have given to the enrichment of the museums in England and the United States some thousands of ethnological, archaeological, and ichthyological specimens. Never have I accepted a penny from a museum or institution, either to finance my expeditions or in reward for my endeavors.
During the 1920s, Mitchell-Hedges explored the Central American country of Belize, and it was here that his link to the world's most famous crystal skull began. Accompanying Mitchell-Hedges was his 16-year-old adopted daughter, Anna. Anna had lost both her parents by the age of 10. Her mother had died during childbirth, and her father in the First World War. Mitchell-Hedges had taken the French-Canadian orphan under his wing in 1917, and Anna became his frequent travel companion. At this stage, they weren't looking for crystal skulls. Mitchell-Hedges was determined to find one of the lost cities of the ancient Maya civilization deep inside the jungle.
If we could find it, we hope to be able to add considerably to the knowledge of the Mayan civilization.
The earliest traces of the Maya go back at least to 1500 BC and possibly as much as 2200 to 2500 BC.
The Maya were one of the ancient world's most advanced civilizations before their collapse more than 1,000 years ago. Their empire stretched across an area from southern Mexico to the Caribbean coast of Belize. The Maya people developed complex writing and mathematical systems. Their astronomers mapped the stars and measured time with calendars as precise as the ones we use today. Great artists created fine sculptures, carvings, paintings, murals, pottery, textiles, and jewelry. They constructed monumental cities with intricate temples, plazas, aqueducts, roads, and pyramids.
It's interesting how much archaeological work in the Maya area is surrounded by a kind of a miasma of romantic quality, you know, the sort of gleaming white temples in the jungle.
It was those gleaming white temples that Mitchell-Hedges was now hoping to discover.
I had repeatedly heard natives talk of great mounds of stone buried in the jungle, and I had a rough idea in which area they lay.
Like her father, Anna would record their adventures together in great detail, and it's her accounts we largely rely on today.
We arrived in Belize and went into the jungle, which was very difficult. And my father stumbled upon a stone, and he shouted to the world, "We can't be far from this lost city."
According to Anna, her father enlisted the help of locals who were direct descendants of the Maya to fell the trees and clear the bush. Eventually, their work revealed something spectacular.
In the setting sun, the immensity of the ruins we had uncovered came home to us with overwhelming force. Slowly, the sky crimsoned, a red glow tinged the jungle and the desolate courtyards, the terraces, the pyramids of this great city, which we called Lubaantun. the Maya word for the city of fallen stones.
Lubaantun is an absolutely fascinating Maya site. It sits on a dramatic ridgetop between two ravines, about 20 miles inland from the coast of Belize, and it consists of a series of courtyards and temples and palaces. It was founded about AD 700, and we know that it was abandoned by about AD 850.
It was here, at this ancient Maya ruin, that Anna claimed she made an astonishing discovery.
I was 16 when I spotted it. It was New Year's Day, 1st of January, 1924. I heard two of the Mayas say, if you go on top of that building, you'll have the most wonderful view. So I sneaked on top, and it was very dangerous. Something kept shining in my face. I moved 1 or 2 stones carefully. The sun was pouring on it. Way down below, through a crack, I could see something shining back at me. I got very excited.
Anna seemed to have discovered a chamber deep inside the pyramid, which was now overgrown with jungle vines and trees. What secrets, she thought, might it contain? Anna said how her father and his men cleared the stones away, and 3 weeks later, on her 17th birthday, she was allowed to explore the pyramid chamber.
I had a light, and I was let down by 2 ropes around my body. I was terrified of the snakes and scorpions that might be down there. But then, through the gloom, I could see something in the light. It was a skull, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. So I picked it up, wrapped it in my shirt so it wouldn't be hurt, and shouted to the men to pull me up as fast as they could.
Experience the past like never before with History Hit's award-winning original documentaries and ad-free podcasts with our expert historians like Dan Snow, Susanna Lipscomb, Lucy Worsley, Mary Beard, Tristan Hughes, and myself, Matt Lewis. Sign up for an exclusive discount using the link in the description and embark on your historical journey from the wonders of ancient Egypt and the life of Anne Boleyn to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte and the discovery of Shackleton's Endurance. Get history wherever, whenever, exclusively on History Hit.
Anna said that her discovery was the size and shape of a human skull and was almost completely transparent. It appeared to be made of crystal and in perfect condition. According to Anna, her father took the skull from her hands and held it high in the air for all the Maya to see.
There was a moment of stunned silence, Then all the Maya helpers went wild with joy, kissing the ground and hugging each other.
But was the skull a genuine Mayan treasure? And who had placed it deep inside the pyramid chamber? The answer, according to Anna, came 2 days later when they were visited by a Maya elder from a neighboring village.
He told us the skull was very ancient. It was made after the head of a great high priest many thousands of years ago, because the priest was loved very much, and they wanted to preserve his truth and wisdom forever. According to legend, it was used by the high priest of the Maya when he was performing esoteric rites. It is said that when he willed death with the help of the skull, death invariably followed. My father called it the Skull of Doom.
Anna said her father thought the skull was so sacred that he gave it to the Maya, much to Anna's displeasure.
I was very angry because I had risked my life to go down and get it.
But when their excavations of Lubaantun drew to a close, Anna said the Maya priests gave Mitchell-Hedges the skull for all the good work he had done for their people. The family returned with the skull to England in 1927. Intriguingly, Mitchell-Hedges kept the skull entirely secret for the next 27 years, when he would write about it in his 1954 autobiography, Danger, My Ally.
How it came into my possession, I have reason for not revealing. The Skull of Doom is made of pure rock crystal, and according to scientists, it must have taken over 150 years, generation after generation working all the days of their lives, patiently rubbing down with sand an immense block of rock crystal, until finally, the perfect skull emerged. It has been described as the embodiment of all evil. Several people who have cynically looked at it have died. Others have been stricken and become seriously ill. I do not wish to try and explain the phenomena.
Five years later, in 1959, Frederick Mitchell-Hedges died of a stroke. No mention of the Skull of Doom appeared in his obituary in the Times, but Anna inherited it. It was now the crystal skull went public. Anna contacted a business colleague of her father's, San Francisco art dealer and restorer Frank Dorland, to promote her crystal skull in the US with a view to a sale for $50,000. Dorland wrote to her in November 1963.
The Skull of Doom, or perhaps more likely the Skull of Knowledge, as I have said many times before. I would like to handle this art treasure for you. We can launch a program about the skull and get your price.
Keen to make the most of her new possession, Anna wanted to prove the skull's authenticity. She flew to New York with it and left it with Dorland to carry out further research.
When I come out, it is so that I take out the Skull of Doom, which was the only thing my father ever kept from any of the expeditions. I hope that it too may one day find a home where it will be revered by all who see it.
Dorland spent the next 6 years exploring the mystical properties of Anna's crystal skull. He worked with various psychics and allowed other people to visit him to experience the many powers he believed the skull possessed.
Soon, peculiar things started to occur whenever the skull was out of the vault. We noticed that when we were very quiet, we could hear soft voices and music. Sometimes there was an odor, an elusive sweet, sour, wet fragrance that reminded me of apple blossom and vinegar, mixed with the unmistakable smell of an icy mountain stream. If we put our hands close to the skull, we could feel a tingling like an electric current, and there were other times when we clearly saw shapes and shadows moving about inside it. Here was an inanimate object sitting on our research desk, singing to us.
What was going on? In 1970, Dorland suggested to Anna that her skull should be examined at the Hewlett-Packard's laboratory in Santa Clara, California. One of the people that examined it was Charles Adams.
They brought this in, and it was quite an amazing piece, very well crafted. Of course, we were all interested in something like that, being quartz people.
The Hewlett-Packard scientists were asked to examine the skull to confirm that it really was a 1,000-year-old Mayan artifact.
We determined that it was a single piece of quartz. It was very clear. Well, we examined portions of the surface with a microscope. We couldn't find any tool marks that would indicate that it was done with modern machinery.
No sign of any modern tool marks at all. This proved that the skull had to be ancient.
It probably was done by hand over a very long period of time, probably more than one person's lifetime, where they take stones and rub them together and use sand and water to polish them out. That would seem to be the more likely way that this thing was built. Could have been, over several generations these things were carved.
All this seemed to fit with what Mitchell-Hedges had written about the skull in his autobiography, Danger, My Ally.
It must have taken over 150 years, generation after generation working all the days of their lives, patiently rubbing down with sand an immense block of rock crystal, until finally the perfect skull emerged.
But some scientists concluded something even more extraordinary. The crystal skull was so perfect that it was made by no known human process, which prompted one team member to remark, "This skull shouldn't even exist at all." Now Anna asked the scientists to do something even more difficult. She wanted them to prove that her skull's mystical powers were real.
The people who brought it in really wanted us to verify, mystical qualities of these things. And there's no way that, in science you can verify a mystical apparition, so to speak. And so we declined on that area of getting involved in any comments.
Dorland, however, wrote a letter for Anna stating that
It wards off the evil eye and carries protection from heaven. Being white crystal and highly polished, it defeats all evils and witchcraft.
now Anna appeared to have supporting evidence of her skull's mystical powers and proof that it was a genuine Maya artifact. The 63-year-old Anna Mitchell-Hedges set about exploiting its potential. Anna's timing was perfect. During the 1960s and early 70s, the Western world saw a new social counterculture revolution emerge, and with it, a new age of spiritualism. This led to a huge interest in quartz for its alleged healing, meditation, and energy-giving qualities. Crystal skulls were suddenly in fashion.
People are attracted to anything that seems inexplicable. So it isn't just touching something from the past, maybe seeing the future, but something that can't be explained on any level that one can think of. That attracts people's attention. People love mystery.
These aren't just skulls, they're transparent and they're very, very hard and they appear almost flawless. You know, you handle them, you look at them, and they are impressive objects.
When you got the fusion of the imagery of the skull with the rare and exotic material of massive rock crystal, you got something that fascinated people, particularly in the New Age cults.
Over the next 30 years, Anna made the most of her skull's mystique and became a minor celebrity.
She would take the skull on tour around the United States.
Everywhere she went, she told people of her discovery of the skull at Lubaantun and the amazing qualities it possessed.
The Mayan priests told me the skull is important to mankind. They gave us the skull for a definite reason and purpose. I am not exactly sure what that reason is, but I know it is something very, very important. I lived 7 years with the Mayan people as a child and ate and slept the same way they slept on the earth. And once you have lived with people who are so down to nature, you've got to believe them.
She would be preceded by a barrage of publicity to the local papers and television stations, which would be told that the rock crystal skull of doom was coming to town.
Laugh at this, says the Maya legend simply, and you die. The owner is the explorer and the collector is Anna Mitchell-Hedges. Well, do you believe that one?
Yes, I do believe that, very much so. Because we've had quite a few accidents happen while we've had it.
What sort of accidents are those?
A cameraman who came to film it, and he laughed at it. And when he went to develop his film, the place blew up. And I still believe that the man is still running.
She would rent a room in a local hotel, and the skull would be put on a black velvet-covered plinth with a spotlight on it, and she would then charge $5 for admission to look at it.
She would allow people to touch it. In some cases, actually to lift it up and turn it round and look at it.
Has nothing ever good come out from the skull of doom?
Not to people who would laugh at it. But to me, it's always been very kind.
In what way do you mean?
Well, I love it because I first found it with my father, and it's my first little treasure that I found on my own, really.
Some people now started to link Anna's crystal skull to an even more extraordinary story. There is said to be an old legend from Central America which says there are only 13 ancient life-size crystal skulls in existence. These 13 skulls are said to contain vital information about the origins, purpose, and destiny of mankind. And that one day the 13 crystal skulls will all come together to solve some of the great mysteries of life. Over the years, some of these ancient crystal skulls may have revealed themselves. In 1878, an ancient life-size Aztec crystal skull was donated to the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. In January 1898, another life-size Aztec crystal skull went on display at the British Museum in London. Then, of course, there's the Anna Mitchell-Hedges crystal skull found in Belize in 1924. Could these be 3 of the 13 ancient crystal skulls that were coming together to save our planet? If so, where were the other 10? Then, In 1992, something strange happened that would alter the world's entire perception of Anna Mitchell-Hedges and the legends of the crystal skulls. An enormous skull, weighing over 30 pounds, turned up anonymously on the doorsteps of the Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. But this skull was accompanied only by an unsigned modern note. It said, "This Aztec crystal skull purported to be part of the former President of Mexico's collection and was purchased in Mexico in 1960. I am offering it to the Smithsonian without consideration."
One of the curators there called me and asked me if I knew anything about crystal skulls. So I knew the British Museum had a skull, so I said, well, yes, a little. And he said, well, someone sent us one, and I don't know what to do with it. So I said, well, I'll take it. So he said, ooh, don't look it in the eye. They're cursed. So that was the beginning of my introduction to crystal skulls.
Walsh discovered that human skulls and skull imagery featured in Aztec art and iconography and were often carved by Aztec and Maya engravers. But there was little mention of them using crystal for their skulls. She also noticed that the first crystal skulls only began to surface in public and private collections during the second half of the 19th century, and they were all associated with one person.
What I discovered about the Paris Museum skull was that their collection had been purchased from a French dealer in the 19th century named Jean Boban.
Boban was an antique dealer obsessed with ancient Mexican artifacts. He first put on display an Aztec crystal skull in his shop in Paris in the 1870s.
He hunted and excavated archaeological sites and sold what he uncovered.
In 1878, Boban's Aztec crystal skull ended up on display at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. Walsh then discovered that another Aztec crystal skull had also appeared in Eugene Boban's Paris shop. Boban described this skull as a masterpiece of engraving and claimed it was unique in the world. In 1896, it was sold to the world-famous New York jewelers, Tiffany's, for the asking price of $900. The New York Times referred to the skull's sale as the highest-priced object in the largest sale ever held in this country. 10 years later, in 1897, that skull was on permanent display at the British Museum. Two Aztec crystal skulls, one in Paris and one in London, both linked to Eugene Boban. In 1996, intrigued by Walsh's discoveries, the British Museum decided to collaborate with the Smithsonian to determine the origin of both their skulls.
The thing that really started us going was that we had a call from Jane Walsh from the Smithsonian Institution. She had been left a large quartz skull and was getting very interested in where it came from and also its relationship to the British Museum skull.
Just as the Hewlett-Packard scientists had subjected the Anna Mitchell-Hedges skull to a battery of tests, similar tests now took place at the British Museum. The first thing they did was try to date their Aztec skulls.
You can't radiocarbon date quartz crystal. It has no carbon in it, it's impossible. So you have to turn to other methods to date it. Now, the way we nearly always do this is by looking at the way things were made, what you might call dating the technology. So we started on a program of analysis to look at the way the quartz crystal itself had been carved.
First, they started looking for tool marks with the most sophisticated technology.
So we have to use quite detailed microscopic techniques to look at the way these things have been worked.
Their tests revealed that the British Museum and the Smithsonian Aztec skulls were found to have some very faint traces of straight lines on their surfaces. Could a Stone Age technology have created these straight lines? The scientists examined the surface tool markings on several Aztec rock crystal objects from well-documented excavations in Mexico. This included a rock crystal goblet, which is the largest rock crystal artifact to have been recovered from a pre-Columbian site. The ancient Aztecs would have used hand tools and sharpened stone and wood combined with sand to craft their materials. The test showed these ancient tools left uneven, ragged lines on the surface. They then compared these ragged hand tool lines with the straight marks found on the British Museum and Smithsonian skulls. It was clear that two very different technologies had been used. Using just hand tools, it would have been impossible for the ancient Aztecs to create such perfectly straight lines as those on the British and Smithsonian skulls. The only way these straight lines could have been made was by using rotary cutting wheels. These were not introduced in Mexico until after the Spanish conquest in 1521. Further examinations of the two skulls were carried out under the powerful eyes of their scanning electron microscope. And the scientists made a shocking discovery. Both the London and Smithsonian crystal skulls showed clean rows in arcs across their surfaces. Only one type of tool could have done this, something with an industrial diamond head. Industrial diamond heads were first used in the 19th century. This meant the skulls could not have been made before then. There could be no doubt. The London skull, presumed to be Aztec and on show at the British Museum for more than 100 years, was a modern fake. The Smithsonian Aztec skull, found on a Washington museum's doorstep in 1992, was a modern fake. And the Paris crystal skull, labeled Aztec since 1878, also turned out to be a fake.
The British Museum skull was probably made not too long before it first appeared in Bobon's shop in 1881. The testing that the Louvre did on the Paris skull seems to indicate that it was created sometime during the 1850s. And the Smithsonian skull seems to have been polished using a technique that was only available after World War II. So it makes sense that it was probably made sometime in the 1950s.
3 fake skulls in London, Paris, and Washington. That only left the Anna Mitchell-Hedges skull found in Belize in 1924. All the while, Dr. Jane Walsh had been continuing with her investigation. She came across 2 records referring to yet another crystal skull. The first was an article published in the journal Man in 1936. This told of a London art dealer named Sidney Burney who had purchased a crystal skull in 1933. The second stated that Burney had put his crystal skull up for auction at Sotheby's of London in 1943, and that it was sold to none other than a Mr. Frederick Albert Mitchell-Hedges for £400. This was 20 years after Anna Mitchell-Hedges had claimed she found her crystal skull in the ruins of Lubaantun. Anna immediately went on the defensive. According to her, there was a simple explanation. She had indeed found the skull in 1924, but in 1943, her father was experiencing some real hardship.
Father was wanting to return to Lubaantun, but was short of money. Mr. Burney loaned Father money, and Father left the skull with him as security until he could redeem it. Then he heard that he had placed it in a sale room, and Father was livid. He paid Burney with interest and reclaimed the skull.
But when Anna was asked if she had any records showing that the skull was owned by her father prior to Burney's acquisition, she said that all his papers had been lost during a cyclone. Anna Mitchell-Hedges died at the age of 100 in 2007. She claimed to the end that she discovered her ancient Maya crystal skull in a pyramid tomb in Belize in 1924. Only in 2008, after Anna had died, did Dr. Jane Walsh get her chance to examine the Mitchell-Hedges skull at the Smithsonian Institute.
The first time I saw the Mitchell-Hedges skull was in my office as it was taken out of a velvet-covered container. And I was taken aback by the clarity of the crystal, the gleaming shine and polish of it. It really looked like a jewel.
Technology had advanced greatly since the Hewlett-Packard lab tested the Mitchell-Hedges skull back in 1970.
We decided to try and examine it in as many ways as possible. So we arranged to have it CAT scanned. We X-rayed it. We took silicone molds of it.
After an array of tests under a highly sophisticated scanning electron microscope, Walsh finally arrived at the truth.
What we're looking at on the screen now is a mold I took from a 3,000-year-old pre-Columbian carving in jade. And it's clear that they're using a sharpened stone that can only go sort of back and forth. It's also a very soft polishing technique that's been used, with a lot of the indentations on the stone remaining unpolished. In contrast, this is some of the teeth from the Mitchell-Hedges skull. You can see some very tiny wheels that have been used to make the indentations on the chewing surface of the teeth. In the final analysis, when we saw these images, there was simply no doubt in our mind that the Mitchell-Hedges skull is the creation of a modern stone carver using diamond tools, very small drills, and cutting wheels that simply could not and did not exist in pre-Columbian times.
There could be no doubt. The Mitchell-Hedges skull was a fake. Anna's story of finding it at Lubaantun on her 17th birthday in 1924 was simply not true. Suddenly, it all fell into place. The reason why Frederick Mitchell-Hedges never mentioned the crystal skull when he returned to England after his trip to Belize in the 1920s was because he didn't have it. Instead, he had bought the skull from Sidney Burney in 1943. He even wrote a letter to his brother in the same year telling him about it.
You possibly saw in the papers that I acquired that amazing crystal skull that was formerly in the Sidney Burney collection. There is only one other in the world known like it, which is in the British Museum, and it is acknowledged to be not so fine as this.
This revelation explains why Mitchell-Hedges never mentioned in his 1954 autobiography, Danger My Ally, a reference to his daughter finding the crystal skull in Belize in 1924. In fact, she wasn't even with him that year. According to his autobiography, his daughter didn't join him in Belize until 1926. That's 2 years after Anna claimed she had found the skull. It has since emerged that there is no record of Anna ever visiting Belize until the 1980s.
It was an extremely graphic account. One could easily believe that she had been standing there, and yet there's absolutely no evidence that she was there at all.
So why did Anna invent such an extraordinary story? The answer may be quite simple. When her father died, she was left with no income. She had to find a way to support herself, and she only had one asset.
Her father was this great storyteller. He made a living writing stories of enormous fish that got away for the newspapers. And I think Anna, maybe having been around him for a long time, picked up on his ability to spin a yarn.
It appears that she invented the story, perhaps with her father, of discovering the crystal skull in a pyramid chamber in the Maya ruins of Lubaantun in Belize in 1924 to make some money.
Through the gloom, I could see something in the light. It was a skull, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen.
Anna Mitchell-Hedges started as a liar, she became an accomplished liar, and she finished as a fantasist.
I first found it with my father, and it's my first little treasure that I found on my own, really.
I think over the years, having told the story so many times, she had come to believe it herself.
Anna managed to spin the yarn for more than 40 years. And most people who came to hear about the skull, or had a chance to see it on her pay-per-view roadshow, believed it was the genuine article.
I'm not really surprised she got away with it for so long, because people are always willing to believe the irrationally mysterious over the rationally prosaic.
People love mystery, and they probably, as a result, greatly prefer things such as the crystal skull to the average archaeological presentation. They'd far rather that those objects were so mysterious that we couldn't say anything at all about them, that they fit, in other words, the pattern of the crystal skull.
So where do these revelations leave the Central American legend of the 13 crystal skulls that says that one day they will come together to solve some of the great mysteries of life? So far, all the famous crystal skulls have been shown to be modern fakes, probably made in Europe. And science has yet to find any convincing evidence that there ever was a Central American crystal skulls legend.
There was no evidence for there being crystal skulls in any of the ancient American civilizations. In fact, the Maya didn't really have rock crystal at all. It's not a native material to the Maya area, so archaeology ignored the stories because they seemed irrelevant.
The fact that the legend seems to be a modern invention won't stop many people believing that there are 13 ancient crystal skulls still out there, and that one day they will all come together as one to save our planet. Legend tells that somewhere in South America, there is a great city of gold, El Dorado. A fabulously rich and sophisticated kingdom that was once home to thousands of people living deep in the heart of the Amazon jungle.
This was a stone city with squares and grand plazas and wonderful buildings with columns and carvings and statues.
To most people, it was just a legend. But for British explorer, 57-year-old Percy Fawcett, it was real.
It wasn't that far-fetched to imagine that somewhere deep in Amazonia there was a major civilization.
Convinced he knew the location of this lost world, he spent years searching for it.
He was someone prepared to put his life on the line, head off into the middle of nowhere, and do whatever it took to achieve his goal.
With his son Jack and his best friend Raleigh, Fawcett set out in 1925 to find it.
They were convinced that this was going to be a great success and that they were all going to be really rich.
30 days into their journey, Fawcett wrote to his wife, "You have no fear of any failure." Then all three vanished. This is the story behind Percy Fawcett's dream. And it seems that he may have been onto something. There really may have been a great civilization in the jungle, but its riches were not gold. The true secret of the real El Dorado was something with the amazing power to completely transform all our lives. In the spring of 1906, Percy Fawcett was summoned to a meeting at the Royal Geographical Society in London and was made an offer he couldn't refuse.
Fawcett, have a look at this.
The Bolivian government wanted someone to map its borders with Brazil, and 39-year-old Fawcett was perfect for the job. His family motto was "Difficulties be damned." All his life he excelled at everything he had ever done. He was a first-class cricketer, an officer in the Royal Artillery, and a former British Secret Service spy in Morocco. But critically, he was a highly trained mapmaker and geographical surveyor who had been taught how to fix his position anywhere in the world. Fawcett's mission would be to survey and map the western Bolivian borders with Peru and Brazil. And his exploration, he was told, would be difficult and dangerous. But to Fawcett, all this sounded like a dream job. The romantic history of the Spanish and Portuguese conquests of South America and the mystery of its jungles pulled him in. Now his heart was pounding, even though there were complications.
There were my wife and son to consider, and another child on the way. But destiny intended me to go, so there could be no other answer.
Fawcett's destiny had been sealed from a very early age.
I think he was about 6 or 7, and the family was living on the Devon coast. He discovered some Roman remains in a cave near where they were living, and they excited him enormously. It made him the center of attention, and it caught his imagination. And I think that it was that single incident that put the spark there. And for the rest of his life, he was searching for treasure.
It was this thirst for adventure that made the Amazon job so irresistible.
There is something about the Amazon. It's the greatest of all rainforests. It's something like 3,500 miles across. And I think it's that mystery that somehow got to Fawcett, drew him out there and away from all he'd loved into a place of danger.
From 1906 to 1911, Fawcett made several difficult surveying expeditions into the Amazon jungle.
Fawcett was a person who had really extraordinary field skills, and it's important to realize that the kinds of work that he did do was not easy at all.
Not only did Fawcett have to deal with the hostile environment,
Disease fevers of one kind or another were everywhere. People were going down within days of starting work in these areas.
but to make it worse, Fawcett was surveying in an area crawling with dangerous locals.
He was in one of the most contentious parts of the Amazon, in one of the most inflammatory periods in Amazonian history.
There were very hostile tribes in the very areas he was going through. There were roaming gangs, people who threatened your lives, people who were killing people. All of this would, to many people, have made the assignment sound terrible, but of course, to Fawcett, it was just like throwing coal on the fire. He loved it.
But as the years passed by, something else was beckoning him. Fawcett was becoming hooked on exploring the Amazon jungle.
Deep down inside of me, a tiny voice was calling. At first, scarcely audible, it persisted until I could no longer ignore it. Inexplicably, amazingly, I knew I loved that hell. Its fiendish grasp had captured me.
Fawcett realized that the surveying work was holding him back, and by 1911 he had had enough and resigned.
Fawcett once said that he much preferred the company of savages to civilized boors. I think that says a lot about the man, that he was someone who was a maverick, who was an outsider, who wanted freedom, who sort of embraced the wilds somehow.
Fawcett's heart was in exploration, but what he needed now was a mission grand enough to satisfy his passion.
When he first went out and was surveying, he heard stories of an advanced civilization in Brazil.
He was on to the gossip, these stories that twirled around and swirled around these areas.
He didn't reject them, he rather accepted them. And it was those stories that led him piecing them together like a jigsaw puzzle.
I had by this time heard in several places vague traditions about the remains of the ancient civilizations, and my imagination was stirred by them to such an extent that the urge to investigate was becoming more and more insistent.
We knew that there were incredible civilizations in the highlands and in Mexico, so why would there not be, in the heart of Amazonia, some extraordinary civilization that people just hadn't gotten around to finding?
Then in the same year Fawcett stopped surveying, the ancient Inca ruins of Machu Picchu were discovered in the Peruvian Andes by the US. It was the most important find in South America since the days of the Spanish conquest. This really fired Fawcett's belief. He became certain that there had to be something even more fabulous out there.
Machu Picchu's romantic discovery was recent news, but my objective dated much earlier than the Incas, and I felt it was to be sought farther east, in the wilds still unknown. All the great Indian tribes had traditions of a once great civilization to the east.
He was in an area which was at the confluence not just of the Inca civilizations, but also the confluence of Bolivian civilizations and these upper Amazonian civilizations. And those areas were talked about with a great deal of interest in the early exploration in the 1500s.
One story that obsessed Fawcett was the historical account of the Spanish conquistadors' Amazon expedition in 1541.
Fawcett was very familiar with the literature of the Amazon, and he must have been hugely struck by the earliest accounts from the 16th century. People like Francisco de Orellana, who was the man who first descended the Amazon and discovered it for Europe.
For 8 months, Orellana and his 57 conquistadors traveled downriver towards the sea searching for El Dorado, a kingdom of gold described by various Indian tribes as being a city deep inside the jungle.
And eventually, as they went down, they met large groups of people in villages. They went as far as finding roads heading to the interior. They heard that there were towns in the interior.
Oriana tells us that there were highly populated riverbanks. And we're talking about communities perhaps of 20,000 strong. So this must have played on Fawcett's mind.
They recorded a different set of groups and different groups of people. Some were dressed, some were not. And they noted that they were in very large quantities.
Could this be what Fawcett was looking for? If so, where was this city? Fawcett then came across another intriguing record housed in Rio's National Archives Library in Brazil.
One of the documents that we know particularly fascinated Fawcett was document 512.
This decaying historical account was known simply by the catalogue number 512 because it had no author. The name of the person who discovered the city had worn away, so Fawcett called him Francisco Raposo. Raposo was a Portuguese soldier of fortune who described how, after a long, troublesome journey incited by the insatiable greed of gold, he and his men came across a mountain path that had been cut by man rather than by nature. And when they reached the top, they saw a spellbinding vista, a huge deserted city. The man Fawcett dubbed Raposo had written,
"We went on into the strange city, and we came on a road of great length and a well-set-out plaza, and in the middle of the plaza, a column of black stone of extraordinary grandeur. We went with fear and trembling into some of the houses, and in none did we find vestiges of furniture or movable objects by which or whose use we might guess at the sort of people who had dwelt therein."
The city was deserted, but within it they found all manner of fantastic things, these large halls and columned buildings and broad boulevards, just like something you might find in ancient Greece, or imagine you'd find in ancient Greece, sitting there right in the middle of the jungle at a fork in the river.
We marveled that this place had been abandoned by those who had formerly inhabited it, for with all our careful investigations and great diligence, we had met no person in this wilderness who might tell us of this deplorable marvel of an abandoned city, whose ruins, statues, and grandeur attested its former populousness, wealth, and its flourishing in the centuries past.
Fawcett was fascinated. Raposo had come across this vast, lost city.
I've looked at it myself, and it conjures up images of a lost world, a sort of city of gold.
Although there was no mention in the document of the city's location, Fawcett now had further evidence of the existence of an ancient civilization deep inside the Amazon jungle. And he was also convinced that this was the same city that Oriana had seen 200 years earlier.
It was exactly what he was looking for. It was proof positive. This wasn't his imagination. This wasn't something he'd made up or that was just the myth story of native peoples. Here we had it in black and white.
Had Oriana and Raposo seen the lost city of El Dorado? Fawcett himself would never call it El Dorado. "I call it Zed for the sake of convenience," he wrote. Even though Fawcett had never seen this lost city, he was happy to describe what it would look like to his younger son, Brian.
The central place I call Zed, our main objective, is in a valley surmounted by lofty mountains. The valley is about 10 miles wide, and the city is on an eminence in the middle of it, approached by a barreled roadway of stone. I expect the ruins to be monolithic in character, more ancient than the oldest Egyptian discoveries. Judging by inscriptions found in many parts of Brazil, the inhabitants used an alphabetical writing allied to many ancient European and Asian scripts.
We don't really know an exact moment when Zed came into his mind. He had always believed that there were certain places in the world that were home to advanced civilizations.
Fawcett was also convinced of something else. He believed that the people who lived in these remote, hidden places possessed extraordinary abilities. In this, he had been influenced by his peculiar upbringing.
Fawcett had a very unusual background as an explorer. He wasn't someone whose father was someone who wanted to get to the South Pole or North Pole. Nothing obvious about him at all. Rather the opposite. He was from a strange background, you could say.
His aristocratic father spent the family's wealth and died of drink at the age of 45. And so it was to his mother the young Percy turned for inspiration.
His mother was very interested in spiritualism and had a very great influence on Fawcett, and it lasted all his life.
Fawcett's wife, Nina, was also interested in seances and astrology, and his elder brother, Edward, was a member of the Theosophy movement, a philosophical school formed by Helena Petrova Blavatsky to obtain hidden wisdom and enlightenment.
He was influenced particularly in the religious area. Among other things, Percy at one point went out to India to be with Helena Blavatsky.
Blavatsky's many followers included Gandhi, Thomas Edison, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. All this greatly inspired Fawcett's beliefs, especially Blavatsky's conviction that there were master priests capable of producing psychic messages to save mankind, and they lived in remote cities in such places as Tibet and South America. By September 1914, Fawcett was getting closer to locating his lost city of Zed, in his mind, a vast spiritual civilization. But before he could go, the First World War broke out. Fawcett found himself in the thick of it on the Western Front.
He fought some of the major battles and was very active, was mentioned in dispatches, was promoted in the field to colonel. I think that for several days he was actually a general.
By the end of the war, Fawcett had received 2 medals, the Distinguished Service Medal for Bravery and a gold medal from the Royal Geographical Society for his historic mapping of South America. But his obsession hadn't left him. On his return to England, Fawcett was more determined than ever to make his path to Zed, as he called it, a reality. Fawcett told his young son, Brian,
"The answer to the enigma of ancient South America, and perhaps of the prehistoric world, may be found when those old cities are located and opened up to scientific research. That the cities exist, I know."
Gradually, piece by piece, clue by clue, Fawcett zeroed in on where Zed had to be. Influences from his past, especially his mother and Helena Blavatsky. Conversations with tribal peoples. Archival records from Francisco de Orellana's 1541 expedition of seeing communities 20,000 strong. And Raposo's account of a spellbinding vista of a huge deserted city eventually pointed Fawcett to just one place. His lost city of Zed lay alongside the Xingu River in an area of southwestern Brazil called the Mato Grosso. All he needed was the money to get there. But Fawcett was facing severe setbacks. Britain was exhausted after the war and experiencing a severe economic collapse.
To return again would take every penny I could find. I came out of the war convinced that as a world power, Britain was on the wane. Many thousands must have come through those 4 years of mud and blood with the same disillusionment.
Raising money for another Amazon expedition proved almost impossible.
His hopes were dashed very quickly. He had hoped that the Royal Geographical Society would provide the funds. He found that there wasn't money to come.
Money wasn't the only thing Fawcett had to contend with. Fawcett's professional colleagues began to question the importance and validity of his quest for a lost city called Zed.
People were beginning to say, just a minute, you know. Some of these stories this fellow are telling are nonsense. This can't be right. It doesn't make sense. Do we really want to finance this stuff?
Many felt that the lost city of Zed could not exist for environmental reasons. They argued that the soil of the Amazon was simply not productive enough to support a large society. Seething with frustration, Fawcett wrote,
I cannot induce scientific men to accept the supposition that there are traces of an old civilization in the Amazon.
But eventually, help did come. Although the Royal Geographical Society couldn't pay for Fawcett's next expedition, they did support his application with the Brazilian government to secure some money. In 1920, Fawcett was back in the Amazon, searching for his El Dorado, the lost city of Zed, with 2 male companions. But the expedition didn't go smoothly. Rains flooded their route and destroyed their equipment. Four weeks into their journey, their animals started to die. A starving dog had to be shot, and Fawcett killed one of their horses to put it out of its misery. The place became known as Dead Horse Camp. Then one of Fawcett's companions suffered a mental breakdown, and the other ran off to Rio to get married. Undeterred, Fawcett carried on alone.
He really was obsessed with finding this city. People were falling sick all around him, but somehow it didn't seem to affect him. He could go on and on and on.
All explorers are driven people. You've got to be driven. You've got to be someone who is able to hang on to your vision, whatever you come across. And yet, this is a man apart. He really was a fanatic.
Always driven by the hope of finding Zed, the hope that it was over the next hill, that there would be a new scrap of information that would lead him there.
Loneliness is not intolerable when enthusiasm for a quest fills the mind. The chief disadvantage seemed to be that were I to find anything of scientific or archaeological value, there would be no witnesses to support my word.
Soon, finding Zed became the least of Fawcett's worries.
The rainforest looks incredibly abundant. It looks like the perfect place to survive in. But the soils are thin. A lot of that food is right up in the tree canopy, up there, the monkeys. Your greatest danger is starvation.
Starvation sounds almost unbelievable in forest country, and yet it is only too likely to happen.
And after 3 months alone in the jungle, exhausted, without food, and close to death, Fawcett abandoned his expedition. Back home in Devon, he would spend the next 2 years kicking his heels with frustration.
The last few years have been the most wretched and disillusioning of my life.
full of anxieties. My wife and children have been sacrificed for it.
I think that his wife and children missed him enormously. Nina particularly was very sad and lonely with his long, long absences, and the children doted on him.
Of our 24 years of married life, only 10 have been spent together. Apart from 4 years in the Great War, I have spent 10 in the forest.
You have to feel for his wife, poor old Nina. Whenever he was back in Devon, he felt he wanted to exchange that love and that comfort that she could provide for the danger, for the mystery of the Amazon.
Who will ever understand that I want no glory from it, no money for myself, that I am doing it unpaid in the hope that its ultimate benefit to mankind will justify the years spent in the quest?
In desperation, Fawcett went to New York to find backers for his next expedition.
These kinds of expeditions were quite costly. So he had to be able to self-promote and to make this seem as the most important imaginable expedition out there at the time so that he could attract the funds, attract the attention.
And Fawcett did attract some attention. His promotional speeches convinced scientific institutions like the Museum of the American Indian and the American Geographical Society to support his journey with $1,000 each. But it wasn't nearly enough.
He gave a series of lectures, he went around to see big business. Fawcett was not a man to bring doubt into his conversation. He spoke very forcefully.
But he still couldn't raise the money and was forced to come up with a new plan.
Fawcett was quite a bit of a self-promoter. He constructed things as what we might call a kind of reality show, in which he would then be able to catapult himself into an icon of exploration.
Fawcett approached the National American Newspaper Alliance, whose members had a paper in almost every city in the country, with a novel idea. He would send runners back out of the jungle with minute-by-minute dispatches of their quest to find the lost city of Zed, so his readers would be able to follow and experience their journey as it happened. Captivated by his idea, the newspapers gave Fawcett a very lucrative deal. Similar deals were made with newspapers around the world, ensuring millions of readers. But most of the money would only be paid to Fawcett on the completion of their journey.
In some ways, I am rather glad that not one of the three of us makes a red cent unless the journey is successful, for nobody can say we were after the money in undertaking this rather perilous quest.
In 1924, Fawcett was back in Britain. As news of the planned expedition grew in excitement and support, the Royal Geographical Society agreed to pay for their equipment. Eventually, Fawcett managed to raise around $5,000, the very bare minimum, Fawcett believed, to get them through to Zed.
I found enough to make it imperative to go again. With the right companions, the right organization, and knowledge of the right way to go in, it can be brought to a successful conclusion. And our story, when we return from the next expedition, may thrill the world.
But Fawcett was reluctant to give too much away to the press before they left.
I cannot say all I know, or even be precise as to the locality, for these things leak out, and there can be nothing so bitter to the pioneer as to find the crown of his work anticipated.
A traveller is someone who wanders along, perhaps just for the sheer hell of it, but an explorer has a dream, has a vision, and is determined not just to pull off that vision, but to bring back information, bring back evidence of whatever it is he or she's found.
After his disastrous last expedition, Fawcett carefully picked his travel companions this time. His son Jack, now 21, and as strong as a horse and as keen as mustard, wanted to go with him. With Jack was his lifelong friend, Raleigh Rimmel.
Fawcett knew what he was up against. He was hardened. He'd seen firsthand the forest. He'd lived there. But that wasn't the case for his two companions. Raleigh Rimmel in his 20s, his son Jack, again in his 20s, totally fresh, totally naive.
Fawcett warned them both of the risks.
It would be one of the most difficult and dangerous expeditions in the history of exploration, the ultimate test of faith, courage, and determination.
So here was a man who understood the importance of precision, and yet here also was a mystic, a man who was prepared to set off with two inexperienced companions into the blue, into a mapless state, and wander around somehow until he found his lost city.
He told his wife, he said, look, we're going to be away a long time. It could be a year. Don't be frightened. Don't expect to hear from us. We're going to go forward. We're going to find Zed. We're going to have this enormous success.
In January 1925, Fawcett, Jack and Raleigh sailed from New York to Brazil, watched by the world's press.
It was a world-renowned expedition, and it was being followed very closely. By this time, they had been interviewed by all of the major newspapers. People were really excited that they were going off to find a lost civilization, and they believed they were going to do it. And so there was indeed a huge send-off. He was a major celebrity. Front page news.
The following month, they left Rio de Janeiro on their 1,000-mile journey by train and boat into the interior of Brazil. Their destination? The Mato Grosso's capital, Cuiabá. Fawcett called it their stepping-off point. On April the 20th, 1925, Fawcett, Jack and Raleigh put on their explorers' outfits and Stetson hats, grabbed their 30 caliber rifles and 18-inch machetes, and left for the jungle. Opinion was divided as to whether their expedition was sheer lunacy or not.
It's a little bit like Fitzcarraldo, where everyone thinks, oh, what a nut, getting a ship over a mountain and putting it on another tributary. But people were doing that all the time. So even though we might think it's the sign of total madness, in fact, at the time, it was a reasonable conjecture and a bold thing to try.
Their direction was towards the Mato Grosso's Upper Xingu River system, a tributary of the Amazon where Fawcett believed the city of Zed would be.
The Mato Grosso is thick forest. Mato Grosso, that's what it means. And it is a devil of a place. That's the sort of phrase he would have used. A thick, nasty place. We're used to seeing a horizon. We're used to heading towards something. But in the forest, you see tree after tree after tree, and no more so than in the Mato Grosso.
Sticking to the deal made with the press, Fawcett used runners to keep the public informed of their progress.
As they went on each step of the journey, Fawcett would write a report, what they had seen, what they had experienced, and this chap would run back to civilization with it. They appeared in the American press, in the British press, in the Australian press, in quite a number of continental European papers.
Jack told his mother of meeting stark naked Indians, of never feeling so well on his 22nd birthday, and that it would take a couple of months to reach Zed, possibly on his daddy's 58th birthday. In fact, things were now becoming difficult for the explorers. In Fawcett's private letters to Nina, another story emerged. Along with descriptions of the difficulties of travelling, he revealed how Raleigh's foot had been poisoned by the insects.
I suspect constitutional weakness, and I fear that we shall be handicapped by him,
he wrote.
There was Raleigh's foot. It was painful. It was slowing them down.
Fawcett warned him that there would be no way out if it got any worse, but Raleigh refused to go back.
Raleigh felt that he'd come all this way. They were so close to the great treasure. He wasn't going to drop out at this stage, no matter what.
They were also approaching an area where there were tribes known to be aggressive.
It was Fawcett's hope that he would be able, as he had in the past, to make friends quickly, to gain their confidence, and in fact, more than their confidence, to gain their generosity because they needed their food.
It is obviously dangerous to penetrate large hordes of Indians traditionally hostile, but I believe in our mission and its purpose. I believe our little party of 3 white men will make friends with them all.
On the 29th of May 1925, 39 days into their journey, they reached Dead Horse Camp, where Fawcett had passed through on his last expedition.
Fawcett sat alone. We know this because Jack also wrote and said that his father had sat alone and wrote to his beloved Nina back in Devon.
The attempt to write is fraught with much difficulty. Here we are at Dead Horse Camp, the spot where my horse died in 1920. Only his white bones remain. Jack is well and fit. Raleigh I am anxious about. He still has one leg in a bandage, but won't go back. So far we have plenty of food, but I am not sure how long this will last. It is very cold at night and fresh in the morning, but the insects and heat are out in full force come midday, and from then until evening, it is sheer misery in camp. I cannot hope to stand up on this journey better than Jack or Raleigh. My extra years tell, though I do my best to make up for it with enthusiasm. But I had to do this.
Despite all this, Fawcett remained upbeat and ended his letter with,
"You need have no fear of any failure."
The next day, Fawcett gave the guide Nina's letter and waved him goodbye. These were the last words to his wife. With just Jack and Raleigh as company, he headed out into uncharted territory. All over the world, people waited for news, wondering where they were. But there was nothing but silence.
And the tensions on the home front, of course, were just awful. Nina had this great faith in him. She did believe that all was well.
Even 2 years after Fawcett had vanished, Nina believed he was coming back.
Any day now may bring a cable from my husband announcing that he is safe and is returning with Jack and Raleigh.
To read her correspondence is heartbreaking. 10 years after he disappeared, she still believed that he would turn up any day, that he was still alive, probably at that point that he was living in Z.
But the news she longed for never came. And despite the many search parties sent out to try and find them over the years, their bodies have never been found. "25 years later, in 1955, the New York Times declared that Fawcett's disappearance had set off more searches than those launched through the centuries to find the fabulous El Dorado. Were they killed by Indians, as most believe? Or did they die of hunger? Or was it something else?
I don't think he was killed by hostile Indians. I don't think he was bitten by a snake. I don't think he was swept away by floodwater. I don't think he's still living out there, an immortal in some Shangri-La, some city of gold. I think one or other of them stumbled, fell, couldn't keep on going any longer because of disease. And then the others had a choice. Do we stay with this dying man, our companion, or do we head off and go for help? Well, there's no help available out there, and I'm afraid they probably all died together.
But no one really knows. They had vanished without trace. Did Percy Fawcett and his companions die in vain? Were all those doubters right? There was no great civilization in the jungle called El Dorado. Had he simply been deluded? In recent years, scientists have made a series of extraordinary discoveries. In the same area where Francisco de Orellana and his 57 conquistadors saw cities of 20,000 people in 1541, and just 100 miles west of Fawcett's last search for Zed, compelling evidence of past civilizations is now being unearthed.
He basically traversed one of the areas in which some of the most exciting discoveries in the Amazon basin are taking place.
Hidden in the jungle for several hundred years and only emerging now as trees are felled to create farmland is evidence of a vast network of ancient sites. These sites, seen from the air, show an extraordinary crisscrossed landscape with straight lines cutting across the savanna. Amongst the open plains, there are also thousands of isolated mounds or islands of rich forest linked by giant causeways. Recently, it was discovered in these forest islands there are clear signs of past human habitation. Fragments of food remains, pottery, cooking urns, and human bones are now being uncovered on a massive scale. Here was evidence of a huge civilization. Archaeologists believe these sites and forest areas are part of an ancient civilization state that stretches over 160 square miles and was once home to hundreds of thousands of people.
It's important to remember that these cities were as large as Constantinople in the 1500s, or as large as London, which was one of the largest cities of the time. These great civilizations were complex. We know that they had complex religions, they had complex technologies, they were the great engineering societies of the time.
Could these be the remains of the great cities Francisco de Orellana and Raposo had described all those years ago? The ones that inspired Fawcett's quest to find his lost city of Zed? If so, why had they been swallowed up by the jungle? The answer is almost certain, that the people met the fate of all the other Indians who were killed by disease brought in by European explorers. With contact from the Spanish in the 16th century, swiftly over 95% of their population was wiped out, and their homes and cities disappeared with them. But how did these great civilizations exist at all if the most modern agricultural techniques can't seem to make the jungle productive today? How did these large communities of the past manage to do it? The answer may be in the discovery of the mounds of black earth, or terra preta, as the Brazilians call it. It is dotted over many areas of the Amazon jungle. When scientists analyzed this terra preta, they discovered that it contained a mixture of common Amazon yellow soil and organic waste. This meant that it was man-made.
What we understand from ethnographic and archaeological evidence is that these soils formed as a result of very simple activities of burning litter, rubbish, the relocating of bits of soil into other places, and discard of charcoal from pottery production, fish bone, and all the rest.
The extraordinary thing about this black soil is how productive it is. It produces incredibly high yields.
If communities, rather than just plant and harvest the yields that would come out of very poor soils, were able to modify soils, then larger populations could be had, larger villages could be had, and hence larger societies could be had.
It does seem incredible that where we now can't do anything with the soil, this ancient civilization had brought about an agricultural miracle.
Existence of these large populations was predicated on the use of terra preta. It increases productivity in the same way that irrigation increases productivity in dry lands, or terraces increase productivity on mountainous lands.
Terra preta is so remarkable that scientists are now working out how to reproduce it so it can be used all over the world.
I think that what we're going to see is that it's going to play a major role in enhancing the productivity of small and medium-scale agriculture, and also to provide livelihoods and sustenance for rural populations in much of the world.
So Percy Fawcett was onto something. There really was a society out there that may well have had a great treasure to share with us. But it wasn't gold. As he himself had once written,
"The answer to the enigma of ancient South America, and perhaps of the prehistoric world, may be found when those old cities are located and opened up to scientific research. That the cities exist, I know."
History tells that in the 16th century, the great Inca Empire fled from the ferocious onslaught of Spanish conquistadors. Somewhere deep inside the jungles of Peru, the Incas built a last stronghold. There, they made their final stand against their ruthless enemy. But with their death, the memory of where this last refuge was disappeared. But one man was determined to find it. An American explorer named Hiram Bingham.
He was Indiana Jones. He was 6'4", he looked like a Hollywood idol. He was a man obsessed with this mission.
Bingham was a tough explorer. No Andean mountain seems to have been too high for him, no jungle too dense.
And he did find an extraordinary Inca city. Machu Picchu. It was hailed as the lost city in the clouds, a spiritual Inca refuge perching high on top of a skyscraping mountain. Bingham was convinced he had found the long-lost city of the Incas, their final refuge from the Spanish conquest. But all was not as it seemed. In 1911, there was a young scholar specializing in modern Latin American history at Yale University, USA. Hiram Bingham. But he was no impoverished academic. Bingham was 36 years old, married to Alfreda Mitchell, an heiress to the Tiffany Diamond Empire. They had 6 young sons and lived in a 30-roomed mansion on top of a hill. He was a man who seemed to have all the comforts of life. But Bingham was restless and driven.
Hiram Bingham had a really compulsive need to become famous, and I think that's because of his family.
He was Hiram Bingham III, and I think that's incredibly important because his grandfather, Hiram Bingham I, he was a very powerful, impressive missionary character, and so was his father, Hiram Bingham II. So there's this legacy, this weight on his shoulders that he had to prove himself or do something with his life at the very least.
What that something could be, he had absolutely no idea. To secure a permanent position at Yale University, Bingham went to Peru in 1909 to study the Spanish trade routes between Buenos Aires and Lima. During the journey, he was invited by his guide to see an ancient Inca site high up in the Andes Mountains. It was an event that would change his life.
It was my first introduction to prehistoric American history. I agreed, not knowing that it was going to lead me into a fascinating field.
Bingham is taken to this remote Inca ruin called Choqquequirao, which means cradle of gold, and is immediately struck by the romance of the position.
The Inca ruins lay 10,000 feet above sea level, and the climb was astounding, with breathtaking views of the distant snow-capped mountains and the roar of the Apurimac River below. It was also exhilarating.
At times, the trail was so steep that it was easier to go on all fours than to attempt to walk erect. Most of the time, we were hanging on to the side of the mountain almost by our eyelids.
On the way up, they saw amazing sights, including a huge condor that sailed down to take a look at them.
We could not only see his cruel beak and great talons, but even the whites of his eyes. It was an awe-inspiring moment.
Bingham was a tough explorer. No Andean mountain seems to have been too high for him, no jungle too dense.
Eventually, they reached the Inca ruins on the flattened peak. For Bingham, it was a magical experience. Choqquequirao was built in the 15th century and was believed to be a sacred Inca dwelling and one of their frontier fortresses. It was designed to defend the approaches to their great capital city, Cusco. Bingham wrote to his wife, Alfreda, to tell her it was the most interesting place he had ever seen.
He's amazingly impressed by the remains of Inca architecture because he'd never known about this before. He'd heard of the Incas, but he didn't know that what they'd achieved was quite as impressive as this. Some people see this as a sort of epiphany, you know, this really changes the direction of his life.
Till now, Bingham's knowledge of South American history was limited to the Spanish colonial days, and he knew very little about the Incas. As he looked out to the distant mountains, Bingham was keen to find out more about them. Who were these people who built this extraordinary place? What was their story?
Those snow-capped peaks in an unknown and unexplored part of Peru fascinated me greatly. They tempted me to go see what lay beyond.
And he thought of this line from Kipling.
Something hidden. Go and find it. Go and look behind the ranges.
You get this feeling that this worked on him, on his imagination, that somewhere just beyond the range was a city, a world, a reputation to be found.
Back in the Yale Library, Bingham began researching the Inca history. He opened the pages of the Spanish Chronicles, a key source on Spain's golden age of discovery, conquest, and colonization of the Americas.
He began reading more about the Incas. And of course, even as a non-academic, the story of the conquistadors and the Incas is incredibly exciting.
Bingham learned how from the early 13th century to the middle to late 16th century, the Incas were the most powerful empire in the Americas. Their domain stretched over 2,000 miles, from modern-day Chile to the Amazon. But then came catastrophe. In 1532, the Spanish conquistadors, headed by their ruthless leader, Francisco Pizarro, entered the Inca heartland. He was hell-bent on their destruction. Over the next 40 years, the Spaniards drove the Indians from their cities and slaughtered them in their thousands.
Bingham really is intrigued by the history of the last Incas and what they'd done after the Spaniards arrived.
Bingham's eyes were drawn to an account where a young Inca emperor named Manco had led his people as they fled their capital city, Cusco, in 1536. Manco managed to escape the Spanish and created a new Inca capital called Vitcos, 10,000 feet above sea level, somewhere in the remote mountainous region of the Vilcabamba Valley. But the Spanish conquistadors were in hot pursuit, and the Incas fled again. This time, the chronicles said, they went down from their mountain homes into the Amazon lowland. There, protected by a dense jungle in the largest rainforest in the world, they built a new city called Vilcabamba. And it was here that the Incas made their last stand. But it was all to no avail. In 1572, the Spaniards finally defeated the Incas. And so with their death, their last refuge, Vilcabamba, disappeared from history. Bingham was transfixed by the story of Vilcabamba. But for all the references of the city, there was one vital clue missing.
Nobody, as far as he could see, knew where it was. This appealed to Bingham as a puzzle he could solve himself.
Bingham tried to work out where Vilcabamba could be. The Spanish chronicles said it lay 30 miles and 2 long days' journey from Vitcos. But he had no idea even where Vitcos was. Continuing his studies, he found another clue. The chronicles said that Vitcos was 100 miles northwest of Cusco, along the Urubamba Valley in the Andes mountain range. Bingham knew where Cusco was. He had visited it on his last trip to South America. But if no one knew where Vitcos was, how would he know when he'd reached it? There was a further clue in the Spanish accounts. They said that there was a sacred area with a large white rock close by the city. So if Bingham could locate the white rock, he would know he had found Vitcos. Now Bingham realized that if he could find Vitcos, then 2 days beyond it, he should be able to find Vilcabamba. This, Bingham thought, would be how he could make his name. He would lead an expedition to find the Incas' last refuge, Vilcabamba. Bingham began to form his team.
He needed to be funded to take an expedition down there, particularly then. It was an expensive business.
The first thing Bingham did was approach a number of corporations. Businesses specializing in America's outdoor country pursuits offered their support. Abercrombie and Fitch supplied Bingham with an explorer's outfit.
He managed to get Winchester to give him a rifle, Kodak to give a camera, and then he turned to his classmates.
Bingham estimated that he would need 6 expedition members and that each one would require $1,800 to cover their travel and food expenses. One former classmate heard about his plans and offered him $1,800 if he would take a Yale geologist with him. Bingham snapped up the offer. Others came forward. One was a topographer, another a mountain climbing engineer. Eventually, Bingham got together a multidisciplinary team.
So he's got a doctor, a naturalist, geologist, a couple of topographers. So it's a pretty good, well-rounded, versatile team.
To pay his own way, Bingham promised to write 4 articles for the fashionable Harper's magazine, but he was still $1,800 short. Only now did he turn to the one source he could rely on, his wife Alfreda, to tap the Tiffany fortune. She agreed. Bingham's party left New York for Peru on the 8th of June, 1911. Their destination, the former Inca capital city, Cusco. This, Bingham knew, lay near the Urubamba Valley in the Andes mountain range and would be his starting off point. Bingham's expedition arrived in Cusco on the 2nd of July, 1911. His aim was to first locate the sacred white rock at Vitcos, then to make his way down from the mountains into the lowland Amazon jungle to search for Vilcabamba. Bingham and his best friend, a naturalist named Harry Foote, set out on the morning of the 19th of July 1911 on their quest for where they believed Vilcabamba could be. The rest of the party were dispatched to carry out geological and mapping surveys of the Andes.
So they head off across the high-altitude lands, then descend into the Urubamba Valley itself. And the Urubamba is the famous sacred valley of the Incas. and follow the river along, sort of heading generally in the direction northwest.
Bingham kept a meticulous diary of his expedition. Today, it is regarded as one of the greatest first-hand accounts in the history of exploration.
I had entered the marvelous canyon of the Urubamba. Here the river runs through gigantic mountains of granite. I know of nowhere in the world that can compare with it.
Bingham writes in the most compulsive way. He's someone with academic authority, and yet he knows how to tell a good story.
Not only does it have great snow peaks looming above the clouds more than 2 miles overhead, it also has, in striking contrast, orchids and tree ferns, and the mysterious witchery of the jungle.
He paints pictures with words, and not just of visual things, but of the heart, you know, the spirit, what you're feeling.
One is drawn irresistibly onward by ever-recurring surprises, through a deep and winding gorge, turning and twisting past overhanging cliffs of incredible height.
He's still got a little way to go before he gets to this area where he thinks he's going to find Vikos, the old Inca capital. So he's sort of working himself in, working the team in.
On the evening of the 23rd of July 1911, after a 70-mile journey from Cusco, and 3/4 of the way to where Vikos is said to be, Bingham and Foote set up camp for the night in a canyon surrounded by steep mountains.
They camp at a place called Mandor Pampa, and they meet a man there called Melchor Arteaga, and he questions him. He says, are there ruins around here?
Arteaga told Bingham there were some fine ones on top of the opposite mountain called Huayna Picchu, and also on a ridge called Machu Picchu, or Old Peak.
People in Peru were always telling him that if he gave them a bit of money, they could lead him to a ruin. And there was a little bit of sort of won't get fooled again feeling in his team.
They had heard ruins were around many times, and they'd gone, it would be one little house or a couple of things.
And this is where I think we have to give a lot of credit to Bingham, because lesser men would have said, oh, for God's sake, you know, there's not supposed to be anything up that hill. There's nothing in the history books. This is just a wild goose chase.
Bingham noted the ruins' names in his pocket diary and arranged for Arteaga to take him there the following day. The morning of the 24th of July, 1911, dawned with a cold rain. Bingham prepared for his climb up Machu Picchu. His best friend, Harry Foote, didn't fancy the wet conditions.
The naturalist said there were more butterflies near the river. Anyway, it was my job to investigate. Arteaga shivered. He said it was too hard to climb for such a wet day. But when he found out that I was willing to pay him 3 or 4 times the ordinary daily wage, he finally agreed to go.
Arteaga and Bingham left the camp at 10 a.m.
After a walk of about 3/4 of an hour, Arteaga left the main road and plunged down through the bank of the river. Here there was a primitive bridge which crossed the roaring rapids. It was obvious that no one could live for an instant in the icy cold rapids, but would immediately be dashed to pieces against the rocks.
He said, I admit freely, I was on my hands and knees going really, really slowly across, and all I could think of was, I hope the water doesn't go up because it'll just take the bridge away.
After the river came the mountain.
Leaving the stream, we now struggled up the bank through dense jungle. And in a few minutes, reached the bottom of a very precipitous slope. For an hour and 20 minutes, we had a hard climb. A good part of the distance, we went on all fours, sometimes holding on by our fingernails.
Bingham was now climbing at nearly 8,000 feet.
Bingham was going up through very difficult cloud forest. Conditions were humid, it was hard work.
Shortly after noon, just as we were completely exhausted, we reached several good-natured Indians who were pleasantly surprised by our unexpected arrival. It seemed that these Indians had chosen this eagle's nest for their home.
A small boy named Pablo Richate was sent on to guide Bingham around the ruins.
Led by this little boy around a corner, and he sees something quite extraordinary.
Hardly had we left and rounded the promontory, then we were confronted with an unexpected sight. A great flight of beautifully constructed stone-faced terraces, perhaps 100 of them, each hundreds of feet long and 10 feet high. They had recently been rescued from the jungle by the Indians.
It is an amazingly evocative description of firstly going through what were lovely Inca terraces, Bingham says, and then slowly things build.
From the cleared stonework, he was introduced to another spectacular sight.
Suddenly, without warning, under a huge overhanging ledge, the boy showed me a cave beautifully lined with the finest cut stone.
And then he's going from one wonder to another.
It had evidently been a royal mausoleum. On top of this particular ledge was a semicircular building whose outer wall, gently sloping and slightly curved, bore a striking resemblance to the famous Temple of the Sun in Cusco. Clearly, it was the work of a master artist.
Then there's the temple with the rounded wall, and then cumulatively, the overall effect.
Bingham was stunned by its magnificence and realized that this wasn't just some little Inca settlement, he has come to see.
It seemed like an unbelievable dream. Dimly, I began to realize that this wall and its adjoining semicircular temple over the cave were as fine as the finest stonework in the world. It fairly took my breath away. What could this place be? Why had no one given us any idea of it? Surprise followed surprise in bewildering succession. Suddenly we found ourselves standing in front of the ruins of two of the finest and most interesting structures in ancient America.
There are cyclopean stones, as he calls them. Stones the height of a human, but beautifully worked with very, very fine granite.
On the east side of the plaza was another amazing structure, the ruins of a temple containing 3 great windows looking out over the canyon to the rising sun. Like its neighbor, it is unique among Inca ruins.
Bingham had made an extraordinary discovery. It seemed almost too good to be true.
Would anyone believe what I had found? Fortunately, in this land where accuracy in reporting what one has seen is not a prevailing characteristic of travelers, I had a good camera, and the sun was shining.
I know that he had a very special Kodak camera that was made for traveling in rugged territory, and the negatives are huge. So the resolution, you know, the detail is really fantastic.
But one question puzzled Bingham. Where was he?
Now, Bingham was not really looking for a ruin in this part of the world, so he couldn't make sense of what he'd found.
Machu Picchu laid 70 miles from Cusco, so it couldn't be Vitcos, which was said to be 100 miles from Cusco. And it couldn't be the Incas' last refuge, Vilcabamba, because that was said to be 30 miles on from Vitcos, down on the jungle plains. So what was this astonishing place? Suddenly, Bingham's eye focused on some charcoaled graffiti on a rock of the 3-windowed temple. Lizarraga, 1902. His blood ran cold.
Bingham was a man who wanted to make a name for himself, and he was pulled up short. He suddenly saw this graffiti. Had some scholar got there first?
Bingham wrote the name Lizarraga 1902 in his diary and prayed it wasn't another explorer.
Maybe he'd been picked to the post. Maybe this wasn't really a discovery at all.
Deeply worried, Bingham made his way back down the mountain. He hardly mentioned the Machu Picchu ruins when he returned to the campsite below. In fact, his best friend, Harry Foote, wrote in his diary, "No special things to note." Bingham discreetly asked Arteaga about the Lizarraga 1902 graffiti. Arteaga told Bingham, Augustin Lizarraga is the discoverer of Machu Picchu. He lives at San Miguel Bridge, just downstream of your campsite.
And at that point, Hiram Bingham must have sighed and thought, oh, that is that. And he actually writes it in his diary. Lizarraga is the discoverer. And his heart must have sunk.
Bingham was horrified and set off to find the mysterious Lizarraga. But when he got to San Miguel Bridge, Augustin Lizarraga was not at home. So Bingham spoke to his brother, Angel. Angel told him that the ruins were known in the valley and parts of it were cultivated by farmers. His brother was one of those farmers. Bingham relaxed. Lizarraga wasn't a rival academic after all. He was just a local Peruvian peasant. Bingham's discovery of Machu Picchu was secure. The very next day, he set off on another long journey to search for the last refuge of the Incas, Vilcabamba. But first, he had to locate the White Rock at Vitcos. Bingham followed the information detailed in the Spanish chronicles he had read back at Yale. He asked every local they passed if they knew the whereabouts of any ruins in the area, and paid local guides to lead him onwards.
He carries on down the valley into even more uncharted territory. He's put the whole thing of Machu Picchu to one side.
"15 days after encountering the ruins of Machu Picchu, Bingham came across the sacred White Rock, mentioned in the chronicles as being close to the Incas' capital city, Vitcos.
It was late on the afternoon of August 9th, 1911, when I first saw this remarkable shrine. We could now be fairly sure that we had located one of Manco's capitals, Vitcos.
If Bingham had found the ruins of the former Inca city, Vitcos, it meant that he had to be on the right track and close to completing his objective, finding their last refuge, Vilcabamba. The Chronicle said it was a long 2-day journey from Vitcos.
By now, Bingham's blood is up. I mean, he realized that these ruins are toppling over like 9 pins. You know, he's found Machu Picchu, he's found Vitcos, and there's one final place he wants to find, which is a place where the Inca emperor and the exiles escaped to if the Spanish ever came looking for them.
Bingham came down from the mountains into the huge lowland jungles of the Amazon. This was now a very different world to the ethereal mountaintops of Machu Picchu. It was a place that even the local Peruvians feared, like the Spanish conquistadors before them.
One of our informants said the Inca city was called Espiritu Pampa, or the Plain of the Ghosts, to be reached only by a hard trail passable for barefooted savages, but scarcely available for us unless we chose to go on our hands and knees.
Finally, after several days traveling, Bingham found, beneath the thick twines of a rainforest jungle, evidence of some ruins. To his excitement, the locals called it Espiritu Pampa. Even better, they also called it Vilcabamba. Surely, Bingham had found the last refuge of the Incas. But as he set to work, he came across something very puzzling. The few buildings he had found were clearly Inca, but their stonework was rough and inferior. Bingham searched for more extensive ruins, but failed to find anything substantial. Bingham wrote in his diary,
After several days digging, ruins well scattered. Long, hard job to clear ruins, hardly worthwhile.
The more Bingham dug, the more he became convinced that the site just wasn't special enough to be Vilcabamba. But if this wasn't the place where the Incas had their last refuge, then where was it? Slowly, Bingham started to reconsider the evidence. He went back to the Spanish chronicles. They told him that Vilcabamba was the largest city in the province. Machu Picchu was clearly much bigger than anything he had found in the jungle. Then there was the puzzling issue of the inferior architecture. Nothing he saw in the Amazon matched the finely cut stone at Machu Picchu. Bingham also wondered about something else. Would the Incas, who are highland people, have really made a home down in the flatland jungle?
It does not seem reasonable that such people would have cared to live in the hot valley of Espiritu Pampa. These Inca ruins are unique in lying so low in the Amazon jungle. The difference in climate is as great as that between Scotland and Egypt. Furthermore, they could have found the seclusion and safety which they craved just as well in several other parts of the province, particularly at Machu Picchu.
Now he began focusing on another issue. The chronicles stated that the city of Vilcabamba lay 2 days' march from Vitkos. So did Machu Picchu, albeit in a different direction.
Machu Picchu was roughly 2 days from Vitkos if you walked across, and he did it. He walked from Vitkos across back to Machu Picchu directly.
An idea slowly began to dawn on him. Could his discovery, Machu Picchu, be the real Vilcabamba? Bingham returned to America at the end of 1911, determined to prove his case.
After Bingham discovered Machu Picchu in 1911, there was very little publicity. Tiny mentions in the New York Times and the Geographical magazine in London, but nothing much.
Bingham revisited Machu Picchu in 1912, increasingly convinced it was Vilcabamba, the last refuge of the Incas. He was now head of a major excavation and clearing program, funded by Yale and the National Geographic Society. Looking over the tangled city, Bingham wrote in his diary,
Machu Picchu ruins as fine as ever. Very impressive.
the material Bingham produced was so impressive that the National Geographic devoted an entire issue of their magazine to his discovery.
The owner of National Geographic magazine said, we're going to make Machu Picchu a star, and moreover, Mr. Bingham, we're going to make you a star as well.
In April 1913, with the cover title, In the Wonderland of Peru, National Geographic published in pictures and text Bingham's amazing account of his finding of Machu Picchu. The news was a global sensation. The public needed little convincing. Finally, it became accepted that Machu Picchu was Vilcabamba, the Inca's final refuge. And Hiram Bingham's name was made. Hiram Bingham would go down in history as one of the all-time great explorers. But there is an irony in this tale. Machu Picchu was an amazing Inca site. However, modern scholars now believe that the ruins at Espiritu Pampa, which Bingham had dismissed in 1911, are far grander and larger than he had realized.
In 1964, some 50 years after Bingham had been there, an American called Gene Savoy, an adventurer and archaeologist, went down to Espiritu Pampa and did a much more thorough clearing of the site and established really beyond doubt that that was indeed the proper last refuge of the Incas, which I think all archaeologists would agree today.
Bingham's initial detective work that had led him to Espiritu Pampa had been on the right trail after all. He had found the real Vilcabamba. He just hadn't realized it. So if Machu Picchu wasn't the last refuge of the Incas, what was it? Today, Machu Picchu is believed to have been built by the Incas during the expansion of their empire in the mid-15th century, 75 years before the Spanish arrived. It was constructed as a royal estate and served as a sacred and seasonal retreat for the Inca rulers whenever the weather was severe in their capital city, Cusco.
Everyone now tends to the view that it was built as a winter palace for an Inca emperor, probably the greatest of them all, Pachacuti. He could come down with his retinue to Machu Picchu, which has a much better climate, and enjoy a fabulous resort-type atmosphere. It was a very exclusive place, which is perhaps why there was no historical record of it. It was a place where an emperor could build his own fantasy creation in the clouds, a sort of Las Vegas, if you like, which, if it didn't have neon billboards, did have this show-off architecture that only an emperor could afford.
Scholars now believe Machu Picchu was abandoned by the Incas long before the Spanish arrived in Peru in 1532. Why they left their great winter retreat, however, remains a mystery. So where does that leave Hiram Bingham today? Was he just an adventurer who allowed his prejudice and emotions to get the better of him? Most would regard that as too harsh. To many explorers, he remains a hero.
Hiram Bingham was the perfect man of the moment. Here was a character with a dream, someone who wished to find treasure, and that is exactly what he did.
He made the discovery both of Machu Picchu and of other very important Inca sites. I think in many ways he is a bit of a hero, and rather more of a hero perhaps than Indiana Jones, because he's real.
He was the first scientific discoverer, the man who took the time, brought money to the enterprise, who exposed Machu Picchu to the world, literally peeling back that forest and showing us what an extraordinary place it was.
I was so happy that he had had the energy and the curiosity and the drive to find Machu Picchu, to rediscover it, to write about it, to make it famous to the whole world so other people could come and really enjoy it.
Despite being wrong about Vilcabamba and Machu Picchu, Hiram Bingham is still regarded as one of the greatest explorers of his age. After all, perhaps, he found one of the great wonders of the modern world.
The sanctuary was lost for centuries because this ridge is in the most inaccessible corner of the most inaccessible section of the Central Andes. No part of the highlands of Peru is better defended by natural bulwarks. A stupendous canyon whose rock is granite and whose precipices are frequently 1,000 feet sheer. Yet here, in a remote part of the canyon, on a narrow ridge flanked by tremendous precipices, a highly civilized people, artistic, inventive, well-organized, and capable of sustained endeavor at some time in the distant past, built themselves a sanctuary for the worship of the sun.
In the early 19th century, stories emerged of mysterious ruins that lay buried and forgotten deep inside the jungles of Central America. But a lost civilization in this region was thought to be impossible in the 1800s. Everyone knew that the continent had only ever been peopled by savages. But they couldn't have created such sophisticated structures. Someone else must have done it.
So Egyptians or Asians had come to Central America and built these ruins and then left again.
But then an American lawyer named John Lloyd Stephens and a British artist, Frederick Catherwood, went to see these ruins for themselves.
An artist and a lawyer go into a jungle. I mean, how more preposterous can it be?
They traveled hundreds of miles through the jungles of Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras to search for the ruins. Eventually, they uncovered the remains of 44 cities.
It was extraordinarily exciting for them because they knew they'd found something the world had never seen before.
With their astonishing discoveries, the two amateur explorers overturned everything we thought we knew about the history of the New World. This is the amazing story of how Stephens and Catherwood discovered one of the world's greatest civilizations, the Maya. John Lloyd Stephens was born to a prosperous New Jersey family in 1805. He was classically educated, a trained lawyer, and a rising Democratic Party politician. And so he might have remained, but for a chance event. During a mayoral campaign in 1834, Stevens's voice became so hoarse with public speaking that he developed a serious throat infection. His doctor advised an immediate change of climate. Stevens took his doctor at his word. He enjoyed the thrill of traveling around Europe and the Middle East, writing about his adventures amongst the ruins of the Old World.
By the mid-1830s, he goes to Egypt and the Holy Land. He travels to Greece and Poland and Russia, and he really takes to it. He seems to have a real talent for travel writing.
On his way back to New York, Stevens stopped off in London in 1836. Here, he met Frederick Catherwood, a well-known British artist.
Catherwood was trained as an architect to begin with, so he understands buildings, he understands structure. And then he goes to the Royal Academy schools in London and trains as an artist.
Catherwood studied under some of the greatest masters of his time. Turner gave him lessons on perspective. Others taught him how to draw buildings, and Catherwood became a highly accomplished architectural painter. Like Stevens, Catherwood had traveled to many of the great ruins of Europe and the Middle East between 1821 and 1832.
Stevens and Catherwood acquired, really, very extensive knowledge, both of them, of the kind of archaeology that was known about at that time in the Old World.
While Stevens had written about these ancient worlds, Catherwood had painted their ruins in great detail. But then, Stevens and Catherwood would hear rumors of a new world civilization, which would define the path they would follow for the rest of their lives.
They come together and discuss what is just about on the radar at the time, and this is these curious remnants of some sort of ancient civilization in Central America.
Catherwood showed Stevens an intriguing book called Descriptions of an Ancient City. Published in 1822, it displayed illustrations of ruins with palaces and pyramids covered with characters and symbols in a mysterious place called Palenque in southern Mexico.
Catherwood showed him a series of books. One of them provided quite an avid description of Palenque, but had decided that, like so many scholars of the time, that it couldn't have been the native Indians that had created these ruins.
The idea that there had ever been a Native American civilization deep in the jungles of Central America was unthinkable to many in the 1800s.
Indigenous Indians could not have built these ruins, could not have built such great palaces, and they were magnificent palaces for a culture that never moved beyond stone tools.
Indians, according to historians of the day, were thought to be savage and primitive, and not capable of building such sophisticated cities. The view was that the ruins at Palenque must have been the work of other cultures.
They must have been an ancient culture from across the sea. So Egyptians or Asians had come to Central America and built these ruins and then left again.
The reason for this view was that historians had very fixed ideas. Critically, they believed all civilizations had to conform to a certain set of rules.
In the 1830s, I mean, Stevens and Catherwood, when talking about civilization, would define it in terms of cities and impressive-looking architecture. Evidence of rulers and rule, complex kind of agricultural systems, a writing system.
And then there is time for people to be artists, to sculpt monuments, to study the sciences, travel, trade, have a wealth of goods, have teachers, schools.
Everyone agreed that the primitive nomadic people of Central America couldn't have achieved anything like this. Though they weren't professional historians, Stevens and Catherwood believed that those who held that view were wrong. They could see no evidence that Egyptians and Phoenicians had ever been to Central America, and the images they were looking at were very different to anything they had seen in the Old World. They must have been made by an unknown Native American culture.
Stevens and Catherwood were extraordinarily different people. I mean, that's what makes them so marvellous as a pair, as a sort of Holmes and Watson, you know, of Mayan archaeology. They could see that was evident in the New World was something very, very different.
He and Catherwood together were the first to look at these sites without the filters of thinking about Old World archaeology. Both are very much interested in these being indigenously authored sites.
These illustrations and vague accounts of a lost city aroused Stevens and Catherwood's curiosity. They decided to look further. Two years later, in 1838, Stevens got another lead. A New York bookseller showed him several more works relating to ruins in Central America. One was a large folio based on the personal explorations and illustrations of French archaeologist Jean-Frederick Waldeck, which had just been published in Paris. These pages showed again the illustrations of the Palenque ruins in Mexico, first made known to Stevens by Catherwood. And there was more. The book also revealed illustrations of another strange ruin in Uxmal, in the Yucatan region of Mexico. Stevens then learned from the bookseller that yet a further set of ruins were said to exist in an area called Copan, in modern-day Honduras.
Stevens had read an account by a man called Juan Galindo, who'd actually been to Copan and written a description of what he'd seen there.
Monstrous figures are found among the ruins. One, a colossal alligator, having in its jaws a figure with a human face, but with the paws of an animal.
Stevens was stunned. He had now heard of three separate ruined cities. Palenque in southern Mexico, Uxmal in the Yucatan, and Copan in Honduras, all in the same region, but hundreds of miles apart. And who knew if there were any more? Stevens began to wonder, could these ruins be evidence that there had once been a great civilization in that region?
He is, among the first of these explorer writers to begin connecting the dots and thinking about this as a coherent civilization.
Stevens could see that there must be some connection between these ruins. And these weren't just one palace here and one palace there, completely different groups. There must have been something between them.
Back at home, Stevens became convinced he was onto something and was determined to find these 3 ruins he'd learned about: Palenque, Uxmal, and Copan. He began to plan an expedition to Central America. Because Stevens was now earning substantial royalties from his successful travel books, he invited his artist friend, Frederick Catherwood, to go with him. Stevens sent him word to get ready. The deal meant that Catherwood would illustrate any ruins they find in Central America, and Stevens would pay for it. Catherwood packed his brushes, paints, and reams of paper. He also packed machetes and pistols, as there was a real chance of trouble where they were going. British Honduras and Guatemala were in the middle of a violent border dispute, and the area was considered a very dangerous place to visit. Stevens realized that they were going to need all the help they could get. He persuaded the US President, Martin Van Buren, to appoint him as a special ambassador to Central America to help ease their way through the unstable region.
He's even given a special sort of frock coat to wear for the sort of official occasions. So he has that diplomatic mission which runs alongside the artistic and historical mission.
The only problem was, the 4 previous US ambassadors to have held this position had all died in office in Central America. Stevens received a letter from one of their widows, whose husband had died of malaria. It concluded with the ominous words, "May you be more fortunate than any of your predecessors have been." Stevens and Catherwood left New York on the 3rd of October, 1839, determined to locate the 3 ruins buried deep in the jungles of Central America. After a month at sea, the 2 explorers arrived in Belize on the northeastern coast of Central America. Their plan was to first head towards one of the mysterious lost cities Stevens had heard about in New York. It was called Copan, and it lay in the western region of Honduras, close to the Guatemalan border. In honor of Stevens' diplomatic position, they were guests of the British governor in Belize, Colonel MacDonald, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. MacDonald warned them they were entering dangerous country, and his diplomatic pass would hold no sway with any rebel forces they may encounter. MacDonald put Stevens and Catherwood on a government steamboat and told them that if danger did threaten, they were to hang out their flag and send word to him. Then he sent them on their way with a 13-gun salute. Undaunted, they arrived on the coast of eastern Guatemala the following morning. Now the 2 explorers had to climb over the Mico mountain range to reach the Guatemalan border with Honduras. Once there, they would enter Honduras and go on to Copan. Stevens hired a guide who was fluent in Spanish and knew the grueling mountain pass that loomed ahead. Although only just over 4,000 feet, Mico Mountain was a treacherous route to cross. Stevens later described their experience in his book of the expedition, Incidents of Travel in Central America.
For 5 long hours, we were dragged through mud holes, squeezed in gullies, knocked against trees, and tumbled over roots. Every step required care and great physical exertion. I felt that our inglorious epitaph might be tossed over the head of a mule, framed by the trunk of a mahogany tree, and buried in the mud of Mico Mountain.
Catherwood looked at Stevens and groaned.
If I'd known of this cursed Mico Mountain before I agreed to come, you would have come to Central America alone.
Here's a guy in a jungle with guns on each hip and a sword, and in all likelihood wearing shades because he suffered from eye problems, inflammation of the iris, and there's a reference to him wearing spectacles. I mean, that picture, when you think about it, I mean, Keith Richards got nothing on that.
Over the next 2 weeks, the party hacked through jungles and traversed perilous ravines.
It was jungle, end-to-end jungle, with no roads or places to stop off for the night. Food was a big issue. It seemed like they lived on chocolate and cigars most of the time.
They passed hillsides with grazing cattle that reminded Stevens of rural England, were hounded by biting insects and tropical fevers. And there was also the ever-present threat of running into ruthless rebels.
People get very nasty in civil wars, and the factions were already known to have committed atrocities and massacres and whatnot, and they had a very real suspicion of foreigners.
One evening, Stevens and Catherwood set up camp in an abandoned church. As they slept, drunken soldiers burst in, brandishing swords and muskets. Stevens recalled this incident in his account of the expedition.
Here we were in the hands of men who would have been turned out of any decent state prison lest they should contaminate the other inmates. Their appearance was ferocious, and doubtless, if we had attempted to escape, they would have been glad of the excuse for murder.
Luckily, the following morning, the soldiers had sobered up. Stevens and Catherwood were allowed to continue their journey to Copan. "14 days after arriving in Belize, the two men finally reached the area of Copan, a remote jungle region, little known by locals and rarely visited by travelers. As the two explorers worked their way through the dense forest, they suddenly came to a bank of a river. Across the water, Stephen's eyes fell on a large stone wall rising out of the undergrowth. It was 100 feet high and covered in thick, constricting vines.
It had more the character of a structure than anything we had ever seen ascribed to the Aborigines of America.
Stephens and Catherwood crossed the river to investigate. Stephens would vividly describe their experience of Copan and how they first set eyes on the ruins in his book of the expedition.
I am entering abruptly a new world. It is impossible to describe the interest with which I explored these ruins. The ground was entirely new. There were no guidebooks or guides. The whole was a virgin soil. We could not see 10 yards before us and never knew what we should stumble upon next.
Stephens realized they had to clear the ruins of its tangle of jungle vines before they could really understand what lay beneath them. Just as they were about to begin, they had an unexpected problem. The local landowner appeared. Stephens explained he wanted to clear and explore the ruins and offered to buy the land.
When his host is sort of balking at the idea, the first thing that Stephens does is he opens up his trunk, pulls out his diplomatic, sort of uniform, and claims that his host was overwhelmed by his shiny, American Eagle buttons.
At last, Stephens' diplomatic status became useful. He was allowed to purchase the Copan land for $50. Now, they could set to work. The following morning, the systematic clearing of the Copan ruins began.
Copan was extraordinarily overgrown at this point, so they were seeing little bits and pieces of Copan at a time.
At one time, we stopped to cut away branches and vines, which concealed the face of a monument, and dig around and bring to light a fragment, a sculptured corner of which protruded from the earth.
It'd be like finding one statue in Egypt and not knowing yet that the pyramids were there.
We go now and we travel there now, and they look very clinical almost, because they're very nicely cut lawns and all of the trees have been taken away. But they would have seen them thoroughly immersed in jungle.
I leaned over with breathless anxiety. An eye, an ear, a foot, or a hand was disentombed. And when the machete rang against the chiseled stone, I cleared out the loose earth with my hands.
As Stephens ran the excavations, Catherwood set up his station in the jungle to record the mysterious structures they were discovering. He used a piece of equipment called a camera lucida to help him detail what he was seeing with great accuracy.
He had with him this apparatus, the camera lucida. The light came through a kind of prism and gave you an image which you could see on a piece of paper, and you could pretty much sketch it or trace it. And it was a great help to Catherwood.
Catherwood, with his incredible knowledge of architecture, must have realized right away that this was something quite unique and that he was in a unique place, qualified to record it.
As Stevens and Catherwood gradually cleared away the jungle vines, they began to unearth evidence of a very sophisticated society.
They saw fantastic little elements of sculpture which intrigued them. And then eventually, as they carried on, they began to see these very large, great big monoliths. Seeing these, which clearly convinced them that this was something, they'd never seen anything like that before.
Working our way through the thick woods, we came upon a square stone column, about 14 feet high and 3 feet on each side from the base to the top. The front was the figure of the man, curiously and richly dressed, and the face evidently a portrait. Our guide called it an idol. And before it was a large block of stone sculptured with figures, which he called an altar. The sight of this unexpected monument gave us the assurance that the objects we were in search of were interesting, not only as the remains of an unknown people, but as works of art, proving that the people who once occupied the continent of America were not savages.
Right away, you can see how open he is, because he doesn't say, oh, that's a monster or a crude representation of the devil or something. He observes that they're very complex, must have been made by very talented people.
As the days passed, Stevens and Catherwood uncovered monumental structures that could have housed hundreds of people, and building blocks that showed all the hallmarks of a great civilization. They found large squares, terraces, and platforms with stepped pyramids, temples, ceremonial buildings, and shrines with altars.
We reached a terrace so overgrown with trees that at first we could not make out its form, but which, on clearing, we ascertained to be a square, and with steps on all the sides, as perfect as those of the Roman amphitheater.
I think they really were kind of astounded once they got to Copan, the extent of the cities.
The beauty of the sculpture, the desolation of the city, and the mystery that hung over it, all created an interest higher, if possible, than I'd ever felt among the ruins of the old world.
What is amazingly sort of human and endearing of him is the way he puts it, is that he says, after a time, looking at these things, it was evident these weren't the monuments of savages. These are sophisticated people.
Now, there could be no doubt. The two amateur men had found what professional historians had said could not exist. Proof that some form of civilization had once thrived in this area. And then came something even more extraordinary. Writing. Standing at the center of the ruins, their eyes fixed on a large stone monument with 16 seated human figures carved around it and 36 blocks of hieroglyphs on its top.
Catherwood knew from seeing all the Egyptian hieroglyphs that he'd drawn over and over again along the Nile that this was a writing system. And that the writing system, they talked together about this, probably had something to do with the images on the front.
As Stevens and Catherwood's eyes examined the hieroglyphs, they were aware that all the great cultures of the past had developed their own writing systems. The people of Copan had clearly done the same, just like the civilizations of the Old World.
There were no associations connected with the place. None of those stirring recollections which hallow Rome, Athens, and the world's great mistress on the Egypt plain. But architecture, sculpture, and painting, all the arts which embellish life, had flourished in this overgrown forest. Orators, warriors, and statesmen, beauty, ambition, and glory had lived and passed away.
But it begged the question, who had built this place and what had become of them?
The city was desolate. It lay before us like a shattered bark amidst the ocean, her masts gone, her name effaced, her crew perished, and none to tell whence she came, to whom she belonged, how long at her voyage, or what caused her destruction. In the ruined cities of Egypt, even in the long-lost Petra, the stranger knows the story of the vestiges around it.
Stevens was convinced the answer to who had built this civilization had to lie in the hieroglyphs. One day, when someone could read them, they would be able to understand the history of those who had lived here.
In regards to the age of this desolate city, I shall not at present offer any conjecture. One thing I believe, that its history is graven on its monuments.
Stevens really believed that these were historical documents, that they weren't simply, say, astronomical observations, that they're the stories of real people's lives.
Spurred on by their amazing discovery at Copan, Stevens and Catherwood continued their trek across Central America in search of other ruins.
They know that somewhere out there there's this palenque, and they've seen illustrations of that. So they were maybe already considering, well, maybe there's a very large area here. We don't know how it's constructed, whether it's an empire, whether these are kind of city-states. There was something definably similar across a wide area.
Over the next 2 years, they explored a vast region and traveled through Honduras, Guatemala, and the Yucatan in southeastern Mexico. Stevens and Catherwood uncovered, surveyed, and recorded another 43 ruined cities that had lain buried and forgotten for hundreds of years, including Uxmal, Palenque, Chichen Itza, and Tulum. And they found evidence of everything that people believed was needed for a civilization. Vast cities with central areas containing grand plazas, royal courts, and governors' palaces, proof of a sophisticated social hierarchy. ornate temples, stepped pyramids, and monuments bearing hieroglyphic descriptions, proof of an organized religion. Gymnasiums and ball courts, astronomical observatories, intensive farming land, markets and trading centers, outlying villages, lookout towers and defensive walls with linking roads and causeways. All with a common architectural style that confirmed that there was once a single vast civilization here. Stevens and Catherwood returned to New York in the spring of 1842. They faced a new challenge. They had to convince the world that what they had discovered in Central America was truly groundbreaking. There really was a vast civilization that had once existed and thrived in a place where nobody believed there could be one. Stevens decided the best way to achieve this would be to publish a written, illustrated record of their expeditions. His first book, Incidents of Travel in Central America, came out in 1841 and was quickly followed by Incidents of Travel in Yucatan in 1843. Stevens' books contained over 200 Catherwood engravings and were an instant success, selling more than 20,000 copies within the first 3 months.
His volumes were really within the reach of the middle-class American reading public. And so the ruins reached a far wider audience than they ever had before.
Edgar Allan Poe called Stevens' work perhaps the most thrilling book on travel ever published. Catherwood then released his own volume, Views of Ancient Monuments in Central America, the following year. It documented their spectacular discoveries with 25 stunning hand-colored lithographs, which vividly brought the beautiful carved monuments, temples, and pyramids back to life.
What Catherwood did with his drawings was not so much just make pictures. He used the word draw in its larger sense of pulling. He pulled, basically drew an entire civilization out of the past into the present.
I think that there is a real parallel between Catherwood's painstaking illustration of every inch of a monument and Stevens doing the same thing in prose.
Together, the writings of Stevens and the illustrations of Catherwood would captivate the imagination of their readers.
Stephen had a fantastic rhetoric. His writing style was clear, descriptive, immersive, and he really portrayed a lot of his passion for what he was doing through his writing.
It was a perfect example of how the words and the images complemented one another. Neither one could have pulled this off on their own.
But for all their extraordinary revelations, there was still one question they could not answer. As Stevens wrote,
I now bid farewell to the ruins. I leave them with all mystery around them, and in the feeble hope that these imperfect pages may in some way throw a glimmer of light upon the great and long vainly mooted question: who were the peoplers of America?
Stevens and Catherwood would never know the answer. They both died early in their lives. Stevens from malaria at the age of 47, and Catherwood drowned when his ship sank crossing the Atlantic in 1854. He was 55. But eventually, Stevens' prediction would come true. When someone could read their hieroglyphic descriptions, they would understand who these people were. Over the next 170 years, the secrets of this culture's history were indeed proved to be in their writing.
Stevens is really the first Western explorer in Central America and Mexico, both to believe in indigenous authorship of the ruins and to glean the importance of the glyphs.
Archaeologists, inspired by Stevens and Catherwood's explorations, managed to read the writings and the images, and a picture emerged of the rise and fall of one of the world's greatest civilizations, the Maya. The earliest traces of their existence go back to 1500 BC, and possibly as far as 2500 BC. Their kingdoms stretched across a vast area of Central America, from southern Mexico to the Atlantic and the Caribbean coast of Belize. Stevens and Catherwood's first discovery, Copan, was established in 450 AD and lasted for 400 years. With 20,000 people in an area of 100 square miles, it was the Athens of Central America from the 5th to the 9th centuries AD, at a time when Europe was lost in the Dark Ages. Copan, by any standards, was a highly developed and advanced civilization.
The Maya were a hugely sophisticated society and culture. They had a very complicated mathematics system. They were one of the few ancient groups to use the concept of zero, which is hugely important for mathematics. They had very detailed astronomy. They knew the movements of the planets and stars. They mapped the movement of Venus, for example, with a great amount of detail. Their calendar was very, very accurate, more accurate in many ways than Western calendars of a similar period. They managed to build these temples without the use of metal tools. They had very little metalwork, other than gold and silver for decorative purposes. They never had the wheel. They didn't have pack animals. There was no horses or carts or anything like that. But they were able to create temples as large, if not larger than those in Egypt.
Stevens and Catherwood's revelation that a mighty Maya civilization lay buried in the Central American jungle was one of the greatest discoveries of their age.
An artist and a lawyer go into a jungle. I mean, that's what, how more preposterous can it be? But the thing was, the very different personalities with that overlap produced this amazing scope, which would never have happened if they hadn't been that different.
Stevens and Catherwood proved that you didn't need to be a professional academic to be a great historian. What you needed was passion, an attention to detail, and an open mind.
I think, essentially in finally judging their achievement, you had these two people that complement each other wonderfully well, with this extraordinarily vivid text and the marvelous illustrations. And what you do have here, you have two people that have established the study of the Maya.
It was remarkable, not just an intellectual achievement. It was a feat of endurance. These were heroes. They produced a remarkable event under life-threatening circumstances. I think it was one of the great exploratory triumphs, absolutely, in history.
With their astonishing discoveries, the two amateur explorers overturned every prejudice we had about the development of cultures in the New World. Stevens and Catherwood had proved beyond doubt Native Americans had constructed a sophisticated civilization that compared to any of the finest ancient civilizations of the Old World.